The night was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you're alone. The clock ticked sluggishly toward midnight, and somewhere in the distance, a lone dog howled, its eerie cry slicing through the stillness. Nights like these have a way of bringing back stories. Stories that linger in the back of your mind, stories you wish you could forget. But no matter how hard you try, they always come creeping back when the world goes quiet. Tonight, we dive into 3 terrifying true stories, accounts of ordinary people who encountered something they couldn't explain, something that changed them forever. These aren't just urban legends or campfire tales. These are real experiences, shared by those who lived through the horror of the dead of night. The first story comes from a young woman named Emily. She had just moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, eager to start a new chapter of her life. But from the very first night, something felt off. The air was thick, the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should be, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her door, long after everyone had gone to bed. She convinced herself it was just an old building settling, the kind of thing she'd get used to over time. But then, she started waking up at exactly 3:12 a.m. every night. And each time, she'd hear the same thing, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on her bedroom door. At first, she tried to ignore it. Maybe it was her imagination, or maybe she was just paranoid from moving into a new place alone. But on the 4th night, she decided to check. Heart pounding, she crept to the door and pressed her ear against the wood, holding her breath. Silence. She exhaled, feeling foolish, and was just about to turn back when, knock, knock, knock. The sound was so close, so deliberate, that she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. She knew she should open the door, prove to herself that there was nothing there. But every instinct in her body screamed at her to stay put. So she did. She crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, and forced herself to wait for sunrise. But as the first rays of morning light crept through her window, she realized something that made her blood run cold. The door was still locked from the inside. No one could have been knocking. Emily wasn't the only one who had a brush with something unexplainable in the dead of night. The second story comes from a man named Daniel, who took a late-night drive through an empty stretch of road, a road that locals warned him to avoid after dark. He had laughed off the superstitions, but what he saw that night made him question everything he thought he knew about the world. And then, there's Marcus, a security guard working the graveyard shift at an abandoned building. He thought he was alone, until the cameras picked up something he couldn't see with his own eyes. 3 people. 3 terrifying encounters. And 3 reasons why some nights, no matter how tired you are, sleep is the last thing you want to close your eyes for. But before we get into their stories, let me ask you this. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was in the room with you? Maybe you brushed it off, told yourself it was just a dream. But what if it wasn't? Emily spent the rest of the morning convincing herself that she had imagined it. Maybe she had been dreaming, still half asleep, caught in that strange state where reality and dreams blur together. That had to be it. There was no other explanation. But even as she tried to go about her day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It stayed with her like a shadow, a constant weight pressing on her chest. She didn't tell anyone about what had happened. What would she even say? That she heard knocking in the middle of the night? That she was scared of an empty hallway? No, that would only make her sound paranoid. She had just moved in. She didn't need her neighbors thinking she was crazy. That night, Emily went to bed earlier than usual, determined to prove to herself that it was all in her head. She made sure the door was locked, double-checked the windows, and even left a small light on in the corner of the room. Then, she crawled under the covers, closed her eyes, and waited for sleep to take over. At first, everything was normal. The city outside hummed softly, cars passing in the distance, the occasional sound of footsteps echoing from the floors above. But as the hours crept by, the noise faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world had stopped just outside her door. And then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, she bolted upright, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. The knocks were the same, 3 slow, deliberate taps. Not frantic, not rushed. As if whoever was on the other side knew she was awake and was waiting for her to respond. Her mouth went dry. Every logical thought told her it was just her mind playing tricks. But deep down, she knew better. There was no way she was imagining this. The sound was real. Minutes passed, but she didn't move. She barely even breathed. She just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. No footsteps. No voices. Just silence. Morning came, and Emily hadn't slept a second. The first thing she did was check her front door, hoping to find some sort of explanation. Maybe a prank, maybe a note, anything that could make sense of what she had heard. But there was nothing. She tried to go about her day like normal, but she felt like she was being watched. Every time she passed a reflective surface, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something standing behind her. The feeling was impossible to ignore, and by the time night rolled around, she was dreading sleep. That night, she stayed up, sitting on her bed with her phone in her hand, watching the door. If it happened again, she would be ready. 3:12 a.m. Her breath caught in her throat. Knock, knock, knock. She felt her entire body tense, but this time, she forced herself to move. Slowly, she reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the door. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Hello?" Silence. She swallowed hard and stood up, forcing her legs to carry her forward. Every step felt heavier than the last. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment before pressing her palm against the wood. It was cold, colder than it should have been. With a shaking hand, she turned the lock and pulled the door open. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just as it had been every other night. No sign of anyone. No footprints on the carpet. No explanation. Just the same eerie stillness that sent shivers crawling up her spine. Emily wasn't the only one who had encountered something unexplainable in the dead of night. Daniel had always loved night drives. There was something calming about the open road, the way the world seemed to slow down when the sun disappeared. He often drove aimlessly, letting the road take him wherever it wanted. It was his way of unwinding. That night had been no different, at least, not at first. He had been driving for nearly an hour, his headlights cutting through the darkness, music playing softly in the background. The road was empty, just how he liked it. But as he passed a long stretch of trees, something caught his eye. A figure standing at the side of the road. His hands tightened on the wheel. It wasn't unusual to see people walking late at night, but something about this person felt wrong. They were completely still, not moving, not waving for help. Just standing there, facing the road. As he got closer, he felt his stomach twist. The figure was wearing a long, tattered dress, their hair hanging over their face. He couldn't make out any features, but the way they stood, so unnaturally stiff, sent a wave of unease through him. His instincts screamed at him to keep driving. So he did. He pressed his foot down, speeding past the figure without looking back. His hands were clammy against the steering wheel, his breath shallow. It was probably just some weird coincidence. A trick of the light. Nothing more. But then, a few miles down the road, he saw it again. The same figure. Standing at the side of the road, exactly as before. His pulse pounded in his ears. That was impossible. There was no way anyone could have gotten there that fast. No way. He glanced at his rear-view mirror, half expecting to see something behind him. But there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching into darkness. He didn't stop. Didn't slow down. But as he drove, a thought kept repeating in his mind, gnawing at him, refusing to let go. What if the next time he looked, the figure wasn't at the side of the road? What if it was in the back seat? Meanwhile, miles away, Marcus sat in his security office, watching the surveillance monitors flicker in front of him. His job was simple: watch the cameras, make sure nothing strange happened, and check in on the building every few hours. It was an easy job, usually quiet. But that night, something was different. The cameras had been glitching for the past hour, something they had never done before. Every few minutes, one of the feeds would cut out, replaced by static, only to come back a second later. It was annoying, but nothing to panic over. Then, one of the cameras caught his eye. The screen showed the third-floor hallway, a place that had been abandoned for years. No one was supposed to be up there. But as he watched, the motion detector light flickered on. And for a brief moment, just before the feed cut to static, he saw something move. His stomach turned to ice. He reached for his radio, but his hands felt numb. The light in the hallway stayed on, casting long shadows against the empty walls. Then, as the static cleared, he saw it. A door that had been closed just moments ago was now wide open. Marcus stared at the screen, his breath caught in his throat. The door on the third floor had been shut all night. He was sure of it. No one ever went up there. Not since the building had been abandoned. He tried to convince himself that maybe it was just the wind, a draft pushing the door open. But deep down, he knew better. His radio crackled softly on the desk beside him, but he ignored it. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The hallway remained still, the motion light flickering slightly, casting uneasy shadows against the peeling walls. He knew he had to check. That was his job. But the thought of stepping away from the safety of the security room made his stomach twist. Finally, he grabbed his flashlight and stood up, his knees feeling unsteady beneath him. With each step toward the stairwell, the silence of the building seemed to grow heavier. The air was thick, suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing down on him. The closer he got to the third floor, the colder it became. When he reached the hallway, he hesitated. The door was still open, just as he had seen on the camera. It led into an old office, its doorway swallowed by darkness. He swallowed hard and lifted his flashlight, shining it inside. The room was empty. He exhaled sharply, almost laughing at himself. He had worked in this building for months, and not once had anything strange ever happened. Maybe the door had been loose. Maybe the motion light was just faulty. But as he turned to leave, something made him stop. The sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from inside the room. His pulse pounded in his ears. He lifted the flashlight again, his hands trembling slightly. "Hello?" His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. No response. His grip tightened on the flashlight. "If someone's in there, you need to come out. Now." Silence. And then, the sound of something shifting. A chair scraping against the floor. He stepped back, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he was. His radio was still clipped to his belt, but his fingers felt frozen, unable to reach for it. Then, from the darkness of the room, something moved. Not a person. Not something solid. Just a shadow, shifting unnaturally, stretching along the walls, as if it had no real shape. Marcus didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and bolted down the hallway, his flashlight bouncing wildly with every step. By the time he reached the security office, he slammed the door shut behind him, his chest heaving. He checked the cameras again, but the hallway was empty. The door was closed now, just as it had been before. Had he imagined it? No. He knew what he had seen. And for the rest of the night, he refused to take his eyes off the screen, afraid that if he looked away, the shadow would come back. While Marcus tried to make sense of what he had witnessed, Emily was facing her own nightmare. She hadn't slept in days. The knocking at her door continued every night at exactly 3:12 a.m. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, no matter how much she told herself it wasn't real, it never stopped. By now, she had memorized the pattern. 3 knocks. A pause. Silence. She had tried recording it on her phone, but every time she played back the audio, there was nothing. Only the soft hum of the city outside. It was as if the knocking only existed in the moment, vanishing the second she tried to prove it was real. Desperate for answers, she started researching sleep disorders, auditory hallucinations, anything that could explain what was happening to her. But nothing fit. She wasn't sleep-deprived enough to be imagining things. She wasn't prone to night terrors. This was something else. Something she couldn't explain. And then, one night, she decided to do something different. Instead of sitting in her bed, waiting for the knocking to start, she set up a small mirror on the opposite side of the room, facing the door. If something was really there, she wanted to see it. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the reflection. The seconds ticked by. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her breath shallow. 3:12 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. Her stomach twisted, but she didn't move. She kept her eyes locked on the mirror, watching the door behind her. At first, there was nothing. Just the stillness of the room, the dim glow of the streetlights outside casting soft shadows. And then she saw it. A shape, barely visible in the reflection. It was standing in the hallway, just outside her door. A dark silhouette, featureless, motionless. Her throat tightened. She didn't dare turn around. Instead, she forced herself to keep watching. The figure didn't move. And then slowly, so slowly, its head tilted to the side. Emily's heart nearly stopped. She shut her eyes, gripping the sheets beneath her, willing herself to wake up, to make it stop. But when she opened them again, the figure was gone. The next morning, she packed a bag and left her apartment, determined never to return. Miles away, Daniel was still trying to convince himself that what he had seen on the road had been a trick of his mind. After that night, he avoided that stretch of road, taking longer routes just to make sure he never passed it again. But the memory of the figure still haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it, the long tattered dress, the way it had appeared in 2 places at once. One night, curiosity got the best of him. He started searching online, trying to see if anyone else had reported strange sightings on that road. It didn't take long to find something. A discussion forum. People had been sharing stories, drivers who had seen the same figure standing by the roadside late at night. Some had ignored it, just as he had. Others had stopped. The ones who stopped never shared what happened next. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. As he scrolled through the posts, something caught his eye. A grainy, low-quality image. A dashcam photo taken by someone else. And there, standing in the same spot he had seen it, was the figure. The same tattered dress. The same long, shadowed hair. But this time, the head was tilted, just like the reflection Emily had seen in her mirror. And underneath the image, a single comment stood out. If you see her once, you're safe. If you see her twice, she knows you saw her. Daniel's hands went cold. Because the night after his first encounter, he had seen her again. And now, he had a feeling it wasn't over. Daniel sat frozen, staring at the screen. His mind raced, trying to convince himself that it was just a coincidence. Maybe the photo had been edited. Maybe people online were just sharing ghost stories for attention. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had seen her. Twice. And if the warning in the comments was right, that meant she had seen him too. He shut his laptop, his hands trembling slightly. He needed to clear his head. Maybe get some fresh air. But as he stood up, a sudden chill crawled over his skin, like ice creeping along his spine. The room felt wrong. He glanced at the window. It was closed. The heater was still running. but the air around him had shifted, like something unseen had just stepped closer. His breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The room was empty, but the feeling didn't go away. It only got worse. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its headlights casting long shadows across the walls. For a brief moment, just before the light disappeared, something flickered in the reflection of his TV screen. A figure, standing in the corner. Daniel spun around, his pulse spiking. But there was nothing there. The corner was empty, just his coat hanging on the rack. He let out a shaky breath, running a hand over his face. He was scaring himself. He needed sleep. That was all. But as he turned back toward his laptop, something else caught his eye. His phone, sitting on the desk, its screen suddenly lighting up. No calls. No messages. Just the time. 3:12 a.m. Daniel's stomach twisted. The same time Emily had heard the knocking. The same time Marcus had seen the door open. His phone screen dimmed, and for a moment, the reflection in the black glass seemed to shift. The coat on the rack looked different. Wrong. Like something was standing inside it. Meanwhile, Emily was hundreds of miles away, sitting in the passenger seat of her friend's car, gripping her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She hadn't told anyone the full story. Just that she didn't feel safe in her apartment anymore. That was enough for her friend to offer a place to stay, at least for a while. But no matter how far she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The highway stretched on, the darkness pressing against the windows. The car's radio played softly, a static-filled song humming in the background. She watched the road, trying to focus on the headlights cutting through the night. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure standing on the side of the road. Emily's breath hitched. No, it couldn't be. She forced herself to look straight ahead, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. Her friend didn't seem to notice. She kept talking about something, work, family, something normal. But Emily couldn't hear her. She was too focused on the figure that shouldn't be there. And then, as the car passed, something even worse happened. The figure turned its head. Not slowly, not naturally, but in a sharp, jerking motion. Too fast, too sudden, like it had been waiting for her to notice. Emily clenched her eyes shut. She didn't turn back. She didn't want to know if it was still watching. She just wanted to get as far away as possible. But she didn't know that distance wouldn't matter. Because once you've seen it, it knows where to find you. Marcus had spent the entire night watching the security monitors, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The door on the third floor remained closed. The cameras didn't glitch again. The shadow didn't return. But that didn't mean it was gone. As his shift ended, he grabbed his coat and stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. The street was quiet, the city still waking up. He tried to shake off the unease, telling himself that whatever he had seen, whatever he had felt, it had stayed in the building. Then his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, expecting a message. But the screen was blank. No calls. No notifications. Just the time. 3:12 a.m. His stomach dropped. That wasn't possible. It was morning now. Sunlight was creeping over the buildings. But his phone still showed the same time from the night before. Then, just as he was about to restart it, the screen flickered. And for a split second, before the display went black, he saw something in the reflection. A figure. Standing behind him. Marcus turned so fast he nearly stumbled. But there was no one there. Just the empty street. But as he looked around, his breath caught in his throat. Across the road, in the glass window of a store, he saw the reflection again. Not behind him, but standing at the entrance of the building he had just walked out of. Waiting. Marcus didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just stood there, heart pounding as the reflection in the glass slowly, so slowly, began to tilt its head. The same way it had in Emily's mirror. The same way the figure on the road had turned toward Daniel. As if it was letting them know. This wasn't over. And it was only getting closer. Marcus stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. The reflection in the store window remained still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. He wanted to tell himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, that maybe it was just a warped reflection, a trick of the glass. But deep down, he knew better. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get as far away from the building as possible. But before he could move, something changed. The figure in the glass took a step forward. Not in reality. Not in the street where Marcus stood. But in the reflection. His breath hitched. His own body remained motionless, his feet planted firmly on the ground. But in the glass, the shadow moved closer. And then, as he watched in growing horror, the figure's head, still tilted, began to twitch. The glass surface rippled, like water disturbed by a single drop. And then, the reflection smiled. Not a normal smile. Not human. The mouth stretched too wide, the edges pulling unnaturally. It wasn't a grin of amusement. It was something else. Something worse. Marcus stumbled back, his shoulder slamming into the cold brick wall behind him. His phone was still clutched in his shaking hand, the screen now completely dead. He wanted to run, to turn away, but a terrifying thought crawled into his mind. What if, the moment he turned his back, the reflection stepped out? Across the city, Emily sat in a dimly lit diner, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her friend had dropped her off an hour ago, but she hadn't been able to go inside. The weight of exhaustion sat heavy in her chest, but she knew sleep wouldn't come. Not after what she had seen. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message. Her breath caught as she reached for it. But when she looked at the screen, there was no notification. Just the time. 3:12 a.m. Emily's stomach twisted. No. That wasn't right. The diner's wall clock showed it was just past 6 a.m. The waitress was moving between tables. The streets outside were alive with the hum of morning traffic. But her phone insisted it was still the dead of night. The screen flickered. For half a second, she thought she saw something reflected in the dark glass of her phone screen. A shape standing behind her. Her body tensed. Slowly, she raised her eyes to the diner's large front window. Outside, people moved along the sidewalk, cars rolled past, life continued as usual. But then she saw it. Standing on the opposite side of the street. Still. Motionless. Watching her. A figure in a tattered dress. The same one she had seen on the road. Emily's breath came in short, shallow bursts. This wasn't possible. She had left her apartment, left that town behind. She had done everything she could to escape. But it had followed her. And then, just like before, the figure's head snapped to the side. Too fast, too unnatural. Emily shoved her phone into her pocket, grabbed her bag, and rushed for the door. She didn't care if people were staring. She had to get away. But as soon as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her phone buzzed again. This time, when she glanced at the screen, a single message appeared. "Let me in." She nearly dropped the phone. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating. A strange pressure built in her chest, like she was being watched from every direction. She turned her head, scanning the street. The figure was gone. But she knew it hadn't left. It was just waiting. Miles away, Daniel sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had been parked outside his apartment for nearly 10 minutes, unable to make himself step out of the vehicle. The feeling had started the moment he left work. That sinking, gnawing sensation that he wasn't alone. That something was following him. His mind kept going back to the warning he had read online. If you see her once, you're safe. If you see her twice, she knows you saw her. Daniel had seen her twice. And now, as he sat there in the dim glow of his dashboard lights, a horrible realization settled over him. The second time he saw her had been on the road. But what if there had already been a first time? What if he had seen her before that night, and simply hadn't noticed? A glimpse in a passing window? A shadow at the edge of his vision? What if this wasn't the second time? What if it was the third? A cold dread pooled in his stomach. Slowly, he reached for his phone. The screen lit up, casting a pale glow inside the car. He didn't even have to check the time. He already knew. 3:12 a.m. But this time, there was something else. A missed call. No number. No name. Just the words "unknown caller." Daniel's hands shook as he stared at the screen. And then, before he could react, the phone buzzed again. A new message. Look outside. His throat went dry. Every nerve in his body screamed at him not to listen, not to obey. But some terrible instinctual curiosity, forced him to turn his head. His car window reflected the dim light of the street lamp above. At first, he only saw himself. His own wide, terrified eyes staring back. And then, the reflection changed. A second figure appeared beside him in the glass. Too close. Too still. And slowly, as Daniel's breath hitched in his throat, its head began to turn toward him. Daniel's breath hitched, his chest tightening as he stared at the reflection. The figure in the glass was no longer just a shadow. It was clear now. Pale skin stretched too tight over a gaunt face, dark hollow eyes staring directly into his. The same tattered dress. The same twisted, unnatural grin. His pulse pounded in his ears. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the steering wheel as if that would ground him, as if it would make her disappear. But when he forced himself to open them again, the reflection hadn't changed. Only now she was closer. His phone vibrated in his lap. Another message. He didn't want to look, but his hand moved on its own. Let me in. Daniel's throat tightened. He didn't move. Didn't breathe. He wanted to scream, to throw the phone away, to floor the gas pedal and get as far from here as possible. But then, the temperature inside the car dropped. A slow, creeping cold curled around him, seeping into his bones. His breath fogged up the glass, and then, a single knock on his window. Daniel's entire body went rigid. He didn't turn his head. Couldn't. His heart slammed against his ribs, panic threatening to consume him. Another knock. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. He willed himself to stay still, to not give in. But then his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a call. Unknown caller. His trembling fingers hovered over the screen. His instincts screamed at him to ignore it. But he needed this to end. Needed to know what would happen if he answered. Slowly, he pressed the accept button and lifted the phone to his ear. For a moment, there was nothing. Just empty, hollow silence. Then, a whisper. Not words. Not a voice. Just a sound, a breath that sent ice down his spine. Then the whisper turned into laughter. Daniel's body jolted, his grip slipping on the phone. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps as the laughter grew louder, distorted, unnatural. And then, the car engine died. The street lamp above flickered once, then went out completely, swallowing the car in darkness. His phone screen dimmed, the glow fading into nothing. The only light left came from the faintest sliver of the moon, just enough to catch the movement in the reflection of the glass. She was no longer outside. She was in the car. Daniel lunged for the door handle, but before he could move, a cold hand closed around his wrist. Across the city, Emily's fingers trembled as she scrolled through the missed calls on her phone. Every single one of them was from the same number. Unknown caller. Her entire body felt numb. She had locked herself inside the bathroom of her friend's house, the door barricaded with anything she could find. But the knocking hadn't stopped. Soft, slow, rhythmic. And every time it came, her phone would buzz. Her friend was asleep. She had tried waking them, but no matter how loud she called out, they never stirred. As if the world outside this room had frozen. Another knock. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, pressing herself against the wall. She thought about the road, the diner, the figure staring at her. It had followed her. She knew that now. Running hadn't worked. It had never mattered how far she went. Another buzz. Another message. Let me in. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She shook her head, whispering to herself that it wasn't real, that it couldn't be. But then, the bathroom light flickered. The air turned cold. And when she glanced at the mirror above the sink, she saw it. A face. Just over her shoulder. Marcus ran. He didn't care where. Just away from the building, away from the impossible reflection in the glass. But no matter how far he went, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind him. His phone vibrated violently in his pocket, but he refused to check it. He already knew what it would say. Let me in. His breath came in harsh gasps as he turned down an alley, trying to put as much distance between himself and whatever was chasing him. But then he made a mistake. He glanced at a store window as he ran past. And in the reflection, she was waiting. The glass cracked. A high-pitched ringing filled his ears, drowning out everything else. The air seemed to fold in on itself, the world distorting as if he were being pulled somewhere else. And in that last, dizzying moment, he realized the truth. This wasn't a curse. It was a hunt. And they had already lost. The ringing stopped. The city was quiet. Empty. The only sign that any of them had ever been there was the faint glow of their phones, lying abandoned in the dark. Each screen flickering the same message. 3:12 a.m. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Time felt frozen, as if the world itself had stopped at 3:12 a.m. The city outside moved on, cars passing, lights flickering in windows, but for Daniel, Emily, and Marcus, the night refused to end. Daniel's heart pounded as the icy grip tightened around his wrist. He squeezed his eyes shut, whispering to himself that this wasn't real, that if he didn't look, if he didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would disappear. But the cold lingered, pressing against his skin like something alive. The faint breath against his neck made every hair on his body stand on end. His phone buzzed one last time in his lap, vibrating weakly against the seat. Let me in. The voice in his head whispered again. Soft, distant, but clear. You already did. Daniel's eyes shot open, panic rising in his chest. His fingers fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. His breath fogged up the glass, each exhale faster and more shallow. In the reflection of the window, the figure was still there, closer now. And then, the whisper stopped. The cold vanished, leaving only silence behind. Slowly, Daniel turned his head. The car was empty. No shadow. No figure. Nothing. His pulse thudded painfully in his ears. He shoved the door open and stumbled out into the night, gasping for air. The street lamp flickered back to life, casting pale light over the empty road. He stood there for a long time, trying to steady his breathing, waiting for something else to happen. But the figure never appeared again. By the time the sun rose, he convinced himself it had been some kind of hallucination, a trick of exhaustion and fear. That's what he would tell himself, what he needed to believe. But deep down, he knew better. Emily's heart raced as she pressed her back against the cold bathroom wall. The figure in the mirror had vanished the second she blinked, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Every second felt like an eternity, the slow drip of the faucet the only sound filling the room. Her phone buzzed again, rattling against the tiled floor. She didn't want to look, but her shaking hand reached out anyway. "Let me in." Her chest tightened. She squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the phone tightly as if it might protect her. The knocking had stopped. But the silence was worse. She stayed in that bathroom until the first rays of sunlight spilled through the cracks in the blinds. Only then did the air seem to lift, the pressure fading from the room. When she finally unlocked the door and stepped out, her friend was still asleep, completely unaware of the night Emily had endured. Emily never spoke about what happened that night. She packed her bags and left without saying goodbye, disappearing into the morning without a word. Marcus didn't sleep for 3 nights after what he saw. The cracked glass, the figure in the reflection, it haunted him. He tried telling himself it was stress, the long shifts at the security job getting to him. But the fear wouldn't leave. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, standing just out of sight, waiting. He quit his job a week later without giving notice. No explanation. No forwarding address. He left the building behind, but the memory followed him. None of them ever spoke to each other. They didn't know they were connected. 3 strangers bound by something they couldn't explain. But whatever had found them never really left. Days turned into weeks. Life went on. The texts stopped. The knocking faded. The reflections stayed empty. But every night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., they all woke up. Without reason. Without warning. Just awake. Hearts pounding, breaths shallow, staring into the dark. Waiting. Wondering if the next time they looked, she would be there again. Some say certain places hold energy, trapped between worlds, feeding off fear. Others believe that once you've been marked, the only way to escape is to never look back. But the truth is, no one really knows. All they know is that when the night is at its stillest, and the clock reads 3:12 a.m., the shadows always feel a little darker. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to see her, she sees you too. But what happens next? That's something you'll have to find out next time you wake up in the dead of night. If you ever hear that knock, 3 soft taps in the silence. Whatever you do, don't let her in. This story leaves the audience with lingering fear, wrapping up the characters' fates while hinting that the presence could return any time. Let me know if you'd like any final tweaks or if you'd like a closing voiceover style line for your YouTube video.